Hello, Freedom Hill Community Church. Greetings to you from the Middle East. Though I would love to be present physically with you today, it is still an honor to share with you from afar this Sunday. How often all of you are in our hearts and prayers can't be told. It's classified information and above all of your pay grades. Nevertheless, I am authorized to share with you what I hope will be an encouraging message from God's Word today. So let's get on with it and turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. Beginning in verse 30, we read, "The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, 'Come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while.' For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat.' But he answered them, 'You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?' And he said to them, 'How many loaves have you? Go and see.' When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. All ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. America loves the reversal of fortune stories, the rags to riches, the tale of the nobody who becomes powerful. It is a dominant theme in our entertainment through TV shows and movies and books and urban legends. Hey, did you know that so-and-so grew up dirt poor? Man, look at her now. One of my favorite fictional examples of reversals of fortune comes through one of my favorite authors, Mark Twain, in his book, Tom Sawyer. In the story, Tom Sawyer is faced with the punishment of having to whitewash a fence on Saturday instead of playing with his friends. Seeing that he only has bits of toys, marbles, and trash to offer in exchange for his chores, Tom hatches a plan to not only get his work done by others, but to gain worldly wealth in the bargain. So Tom pretends that the work he is doing is actually terribly fun, and he ends up having passing children pay him for the pleasure of doing his work. By the time that the fence is all painted, almost none of it by Tom himself, Tom can boast of the following: a kite in good condition, a dead rat and a rope to swing it with, 12 marbles, part of a Jew's harp, a piece of blue bottle glass to look through, a spool cannon, a key that won't unlock anything, a fragment of chalk, a glass stopper of a decanter, a tin soldier, a couple of tadpoles, 6 firecrackers, a kitten with only one eye, a brass doorknob, a dog collar but no dog, the handle of a knife, 4 pieces of orange peel, and a dilapidated old window sash." That really is a smashing reversal of fortune for Tom Sawyer. You know, one of the things that confronts people who move to a different culture to do kingdom work is the fact that the way we read our Bible is deeply influenced by the cultures from which we come. It can sometimes be difficult to separate our worldview that we were raised in from the scriptures and not read back into it modern or Western ideas and philosophies like democracy and fairness. Stories like the one we have just read can easily become associated in our minds with some variation of the rags to riches theme, where we see that Jesus is capable of feeding thousands with just a few loaves and a couple of fish. We say, wow, Jesus can do anything. So as long as I stick with him, he will take care of my needs. Of course, that is true, and there is nothing wrong with believing Jesus will meet our needs. But just like our culture primes us to celebrate the rags to riches story, it also conditions us to not see beyond the supplying of a need to a deeper meaning of the story. Now, it isn't just a modern American culture that puts a high value on personal gain and not seeing beyond the provision of a need to a deeper meaning. We see that the people of Jesus' day himself also were capable of focusing on the wrong thing, as is evidenced by Jesus' complaint after this very incident, that the people weren't flocking to him because of his teaching or the signs that he was performing, but because they had been fed. Their desire to get more bread brought them to wherever they heard he was. So if following after Jesus in order to have a need met is the wrong lesson to learn from the feeding of the 5,000, what is the right lesson? One of the things that I've been involved in the last couple of years is helping train new cross-cultural workers like ourselves on how to read and study their Bible. Our group's main emphasis is on reading large portions of the Bible and connecting it back to major themes or storylines that we keep in our mind through the use of quotations, key words, and phrases that connect passages to each other throughout these themes. One of these themes is the theme of Exodus and New Exodus. The Exodus, the rescuing of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt through the plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, and the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, is one of the best known stories from the Bible. This event becomes the paradigm event for God's redemption or rescue of his people. The prophets and the psalmists will continually draw people's memory back to the event for the purposes of reminding them of what God did for their ancestors and what he can still do for them in whatever current situation they find themselves. The prophets also remind them of the Exodus to remind them that God rescued them and brought them to the promised land for a reason, for a purpose. Often we see that the descendants of the Israelites who came out of Egypt forget that they have a purpose as God's chosen people, that they have a mission in the world. One of the things that we try to show with these themes is that there is usually a foundation event and then not just an ongoing reference to the event, but a development of the idea. So we see that the Exodus establishes God as a God who not only desires to rescue, but has the power to rescue, the power to save. This event grows in the scriptures, and between the end of the Old Testament and the time of Jesus, we can talk about the expectation of a new Exodus when God will once again rescue his people. The new Exodus will be like the old, but greater, and lead to greater things. Now, even though I'm not with you in person, I can still see Mark Gaglini leaning over and asking, what does Exodus and New Exodus have to do with our passage? Well, that is a great question, and I'm glad that you asked, Mark. One of the most recurring themes in the Gospels is the New Exodus. And this passage is a prime example of that. Let's take a look at some of the similarities that exist between the original Exodus story and the feeding of the 5,000. There are lots of things we could point out, but let's just stick to some of the major ones. First, notice that Jesus takes the disciples away to a deserted place or a desolate place. But when they get there, the crowds have run ahead of them. Jesus has compassion on them and began to teach them many things. So already we have a very similar situation to the original Exodus. We have crowds of people in a deserted or desolate place, and we have Jesus teaching them many things, just like Moses in the wilderness with the crowds of Israelites. Next, we have the disciples pleading with Jesus to send the crowds away so they can get food. This should remind us of the Israelites in the wilderness complaining about the lack of food. Jesus then divides the crowds into groups of 50s and 100s, just like Moses did in Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy 1. He has them sit down on the green grass, so we know that we are in the springtime, the only time we have green grass to sit on in Galilee, so roughly Passover time. Another clear connection back to the Exodus event. But of course, the biggest and clearest connection to the Exodus event is the miracle itself. Just like God provided manna and quail to the Israelites in the wilderness, so Jesus provides bread and fish for all to eat. The disciples are able to feed the entire crowd with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they collect 12 baskets full of leftovers. Once again, the 12 baskets is a nod to the Exodus and the 12 tribes of Israel. Mark rounds it off by noting that there were 5,000 men who were fed. This isn't just an ancient habit of only counting men. The Gospels are perfectly capable of counting women too when they want. This is the final reference to the Exodus event, as it was only the men who were originally counted. So with all of these allusions and connections back to the Exodus story, we have to ask ourselves, why would Mark and all the rest of the New Testament writers do that? Well, we can say that the strong connection the Jewish people had to the Exodus story could certainly be reason enough. There would be few stories that more deeply resonated with them than the Exodus story. Just like the stories of the founding fathers tend to draw out deep emotions of patriotism and duty amongst Americans. Referencing the Exodus story and the work of Jesus would have the effect of calling up all of those hopes and dreams of God doing again what he did before. But as we have already stated, the storyline or theme of Exodus and New Exodus has a developmental or expansive side to it. So not only does the continuing utilization of the gospel, of the Exodus motif in the Gospels in the Bible point towards God's saving power or redeeming character, it also points towards God's desire and intention to do it again, but with an apocalyptic element. That word apocalyptic may have thrown you a bit, but we must remember that even though we have filled the word apocalyptic with end times doom and gloom, it really just means a radical and surprising development that brings a paradigm-shattering element with it. The Jewish world of the Second Temple, the world that Jesus lived in and ministered in, was filled with apocalyptic expectation. Which doesn't mean they were expecting the world to end, but that they were expecting for God to act in a radical and surprising way that would upend the present order. Old expectations will be realized along with a significant upgrade in intensity. Thus, we can expect that Mark is going to include elements in his new Exodus story that will point towards a greater meaning for Jesus' actions. And that is indeed the case here. By telling the story of the feeding of the 5,000 with connections and references back to the Exodus story, Mark is signaling that what the people are reading about is none other than the long-awaited new Exodus. The thing that jumps out to me as I hold these two stories together in my mind is that in the original Exodus, God provided the manna, and it was intended to be gathered daily and only as much as they needed. In Jesus' version, there is not only enough for everyone, there are 12 baskets full left over. Once again, we see that the new Exodus that is coming to fulfillment in Jesus is elevated. There will no longer simply be enough for the need. There will be leftovers. And this isn't just a way of saying the miracle will be greater. It is showing that the purpose of God back in the original Exodus of Israel being a light to the nations is entering a new stage. The Exodus, the new Exodus, will not only rescue God's people in a final and prophetically fulfilling way, the new Exodus will expand the rescue. It will have enough left over to finally allow the people of God to bless all the families on earth. The new Exodus is being launched, and it is far grander than anyone would have imagined. You can see that Mark is building anticipation into his gospel about the new Exodus. He is throwing hints and clues all over the place that new Exodus is about to explode into God's creation for God's people and through Jesus. We already see hints and promises in passages like this for what it will mean for those who embrace God's purposes. Now, it's all well and good for the feeding of the 5,000 to have deeper meanings than we realized and to have all these connections back to the Exodus story. It's great that Mark is signaling through his telling of the story that Jesus is bringing about the long-awaited new Exodus. But what does that mean for us today, 2,000 years after it happened? I would suggest to you that the meaning for us is the same as it was for them. That what we were to see and hear with our minds and with our hearts is not that simply Jesus can supply our needs. Yes, he can do that. Yes, he wants to do that. But if the new Exodus was so important to the first Christians as to be everywhere in the New Testament, shouldn't it be important to us too? Shouldn't we expect that God can deliver us and make us part of his people the way that the Israelites experienced coming out of Egypt? Aren't we too part of the new Exodus? Yes, we are. You see, just like the disciples, Jesus wants us to see the needs of the world around us and come to him and beseech him to do something, to help all those in need. And when we do that, I believe that Jesus still says to us, just like he said to the disciples, you give them something to eat. You meet their needs. And like the disciples, we will say back to Jesus, but I don't have anything. I don't have the training, the education, the resources, the time, the ability. I have too many problems. I can barely help myself. How can I help anyone else? And Jesus will say to us, what do you have? Go, find out, show it to me. And we hold out our hands and we show Jesus what we have. And he says to us, it's enough. Whatever you have, bring it to Jesus and he will multiply it. What you have will not only be enough, it will overflow and bless those around you. Whether you are at 77 Kennedy Drive right now or watching from your home, if you have not personally experienced God's deliverance in your life, I ask you to reach out to someone at Freedom Hill Community Church and have them help you embrace God's new Exodus for your life, to free you of whatever it is holding you back. For those of you who look around and see the broken world, the lost sheep without a shepherd, I encourage you to go to God. And though you may feel as if you have nothing to offer, nothing to give, open your hands and give what you have to Jesus and allow him to multiply it. Lastly, I want you to remember that while brokenness is everywhere in this world, all around us, there are places where there are no followers of Christ to announce the good news of God's new Exodus. That there are places in the world where people will never meet a Christian, never hear the good news unless someone is sent. It may seem like you only have a little to offer to help send workers to these places. But if you are faithful to give, even a little, God will multiply it. His economy is not our economy. His currency is not gold or silver, but obedience. For those of you who embraced God's new Exodus, embrace also his promise to use you to make sure that every last country, city, town, village, and people group hears the good news of God's salvation for those who are in bondage. During these times of uncertainty, may you rest assured that God still provides above and beyond what we need. Not so that we can grow rich, but so that we can use the excess to embrace our calling as God's chosen people, a light to the nations. God bless you all. We love you, and though far from you physically, we are with you in spirit. Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us, to Him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.